Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to be doing my first presidential election prediction between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. But before I start, I'd like to say if you like my content, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload, and also leave a like and comment. And with that said, let's get into it. So this is going to be my first prediction since Biden dropped out of the race. I gave it a couple weeks just to see what was happening, and so there is going to be several changes from my last prediction between Trump and Biden. So let's just start with filling in the solid Republican states like always: Montana, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Nebraska's first congressional district, as well as Nebraska at large, Kansas, Oklahoma, Alaska, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, and West Virginia. And now I'm going to fill in the solid states for Kamala Harris. Those are going to be Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Colorado, Illinois, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine's 1st Congressional District, and Washington, D.C. Next, I'm going to fill in the likely states for Trump, and I'm going to start with the state of Texas. Texas is a state that's kind of been trending towards Democrats for a while. In 2016, Trump won it by less than 10 points, which was the first time since the 90s that it was within single digits. And then in 2020, he only won it by a little less than 6 points. However, polls showed that Trump was only going to win it by around a point. It was seen as this huge toss-up state, and then Trump ended up winning it by a much larger margin. And the reason it trended towards Biden in 2020 was because Biden did a lot better in the suburbs than Hillary Clinton had done in 2016. But the reason it didn't flip and didn't really even get close to flipping was because Donald Trump made big gains with Hispanics, especially in southern Texas. And so that saved the margin in Texas for Trump. And since Biden dropped out, Harris has been polling a lot better nationally. There haven't really been any Texas polls since Texas isn't considered a swing state this cycle. But with how Trump was polling before Biden dropped out, and because there hasn't been any polls, I don't really think Texas is going to get any more competitive. I think Trump will probably win it by a little more than he did in 2020. I'm thinking around 7 points, so I am calling Texas likely Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Florida. Florida has been trending towards Republicans for quite some time now. In 2016, Trump barely scraped by in Florida, but then in 2020, even though he lost overall, he increased his margin in Florida. He won it by around 3.5 points. Of course, Ron DeSantis was elected governor there in 2018, and he also barely scraped by, but it was an overperformance of the polls. It was expected to flip to the Democrats, but Ron DeSantis did hold on. Then in 2022, he won re-election by almost 20 points, which was huge. It was way more than expected. And since then, Republicans have been gaining in voter registration in Florida. In 2020, Democrats actually had the voter registration edge in Florida. Now Republicans have it by over 1 million registrations. So Florida definitely is out of the swing state category. It's borderline solid Republican. I am calling it likely Republican, though. I think Trump's probably going to win it by around 8 points, so I am calling it likely Republican. And finally, I'm calling Maine's 2nd Congressional District likely Republican. Trump won this in both of his elections. In 2016, he won it by 10. In 2020, he won it by 8. And this was a district that Obama won twice, and so this is kind of the voting base that Trump appealed to that Obama won, mostly white working class. I do think Trump is probably going to hold on to Maine's 2nd Congressional District by roughly the same margin as 2020, so I am calling it likely Republican. All right, so next I'm going to fill in the likely states for Kamala Harris, and I'm going to start with the state of New Mexico. New Mexico is a very perpetually blue state. Obama won it twice. Hillary Clinton won it by around 8 points in 2016, and Joe Biden won it by about 11 in 2020. I do expect Trump to improve on this margin in 2024 because, like I mentioned, he's doing better with Hispanics. He did better with Hispanics in 2020 than he did in 2016, and current polling is showing that he's going to do even better in 2024. However, I do think Harris is going to do better than Biden was doing. As Biden's polls were dropping, especially in blue states, his polls were dropping, and so New Mexico looked like it might get relatively close. Now I do think it's going to be closer to that 2020 margin. I do still think Harris is going to win it by around 9 points, so I'm calling it likely Democrat. Next up is going to be Minnesota. Minnesota was a toss-up state in my last prediction. I did have Biden winning it, but pretty narrowly, more narrowly than 2020. But now that Harris is the nominee, it seems like a lot of her support is probably being shored up in blue states, and Minnesota is historically a blue state. It currently has the longest voting streak for Democrats. And in my past videos, I've said that higher third-party turnout would help Trump in Minnesota. That's what got him so close to winning in 2016. However, now with the new polling that's Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris versus all of the other third-party candidates, it seems like RFK is actually helping Kamala now. It was helping Donald Trump against Biden. Now it's helping Kamala Harris against Donald Trump. And so I do think Minnesota is probably going to be similar margin to 2020, probably a little less than 7 points. So I am calling Minnesota likely Democrat. Next up is going to be Virginia. Last video, I also had Virginia as lean Democrat. I had it a lot closer, but again, now that Kamala Harris is the nominee, I think that in blue states, her support is going to be higher than it was for Biden. So I do think she's going to win Virginia. I think I had it going to Trump or to Biden by around 4 points. I think Harris is probably going to win it by around 7 to 8 points. So I'm calling it likely Democrat. Polls in Virginia did show it getting a lot closer. But it never really showed Trump leading, and now that Biden isn't the nominee anymore, the floor for Democrats has gotten a lot higher, and so I don't really think there's any chance that he wins it now. I think Harris is going to win it pretty easily. Next up is going to be New Hampshire and Maine. I'm just going to knock them both out at once. They're very demographically similar, very white, and very blue. And in my last prediction, Maine was likely Democrat, but New Hampshire was lean Democrat, and pretty much the same story as Minnesota and Virginia, just because now Biden isn't the nominee anymore. Blue states are going to be bluer, and so I'm calling them both likely Democrat. So now that's all of the likely Republican and Democrat states out of the way. We have Kamala Harris starting at 225 and Donald Trump starting at 219. And now this is where the change in Democratic nominee really matters, is all of the swing states, because polling has been a lot different Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris than it was for Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. So I'm going to go through all the swing states like I normally do, west to east, and I'm going to start with the state of Nevada. And I'm going to be using Decision Desk HQ's polling averages for all of these states, because 538 and Real Clear Politics haven't updated their overall average to include Kamala Harris being the new nominee. So I am using Decision Desk HQ, but I'm going to be consistent. I'm going to reference older polls versus Biden using Decision Desk HQ's old numbers. And so looking at Nevada now, Trump has a 2.5% lead over Harris before Biden dropped out, but versus Kamala Harris, Trump had a 3.8% lead, and against Biden, Trump had a 5.8% lead. So currently, you can see that that Kamala Harris is doing better in polling than she was doing and than Biden was doing. So there's clearly some momentum gathering around her right now. And part of the reason I think Kamala Harris is doing so much better in polls, like I mentioned earlier, I think the Democratic base is a lot more invigorated than they were when Biden was the nominee. And because of that, she's got a lower floor in all of these states. But it's interesting that in most polling, Donald Trump also has been getting a higher percentage in the polls, even though the polls have been getting closer. So what's happening mostly is that it seems like Kamala Harris is more of a divisive candidate than Joe Biden was. She's getting a higher percent than Biden was in polling, but Donald Trump is also getting a higher percent. So the margin is narrower, but there's less undecideds. And it also seems like there's a bit of a response bias in polling right now, because the samples used in recent polling are a lot more Democratic than they were post-debate. So probably what happened was post-debate, there was a higher Republican sample bias. Now there's more of a Democratic sample bias. But also in Nevada, polls tend to overestimate Republicans. The only exception really is 2020. But even in 2016, Donald Trump did better in the polling than he actually did in Nevada. I do still think he's going to win it. I had him winning it by a lot over Joe Biden. I think he's going to win it narrowly over Kamala Harris. So I am calling Nevada tilt Republican. Despite the fact that Harris is doing better than Biden, Nevada is still a state that's been trending towards Republicans. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won it by a narrow margin of 2.4, and then in 2020, Biden won it by less than that, even though the country as a whole was more Democratic. And then in 2022, Republicans underperformed the polling, but they still did flip the governorship, and the Senate race was within 1 point. So I do think Trump's going to win it this time. That's why I'm calling it tilt Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Arizona. And Arizona is a state that's been trending towards Democrats. In 2016, Donald Trump won it by a narrow margin. It was 3.5. Romney had won it by 9 points in 2012. Then in 2020, Joe Biden flipped it very narrowly, 0.3%. Then in the midterms, Mark Kelly won re-election by 5 points, the Democrat, and the governorship unexpectedly flipped to the Democrats. Carrie Lake was projected to win it according to polling, and then Katie Hobbs narrowly pulled it out. Despite that, this cycle, Arizona has been one of the best swing states for Trump polling-wise. Before Biden dropped out, Trump was beating him by 5.7 points in the DDHQ average. Before Biden dropped out, he was beating Harris by 7.2 points. Now, after Harris has become the de facto nominee, Trump is leading by 3.4. So that is less, but it's still one of his best swing states polling-wise. And the reason for that is because the border is a big issue in Arizona, and immigration and the border is consistently one of Trump's best issues in polling. He's very popular on that issue. And because that affects Arizona so much, naturally Trump is going to get a bigger boost in Arizona because of it. The reason Trump lost Arizona in 2020 was because the suburbs of Phoenix and Maricopa County shifted so much against him. But if those voters decide that immigration is more important to them this time around, then Trump will probably win this state. I think Trump is probably going to win the state by a couple points, so I am going to call it lean Republican. Next up is going to be Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. In 2020, Trump lost this by 6 points against Joe Biden. But during redistricting, this district did get more Republican. So I do think Trump's going to do a little bit better. This is mostly a suburban district, and again, that's where Trump's biggest weakness has been compared to other Republicans. I do think Harris is still going to win this district by a couple points, but I think it's going to be more narrow than 2020, so I'm going to call it lean lean Democrat. Next up is going to be Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is a state that flipped from Obama to Trump in 2016 and then from Trump to Biden in 2020. And in 2016 and 2020, it was very close. Trump won it by 0.8 in 2016. Biden won it by 0.6 in 2020. So it's a very close swing state. And the reason Trump was able to win in 2016 is because he appealed to white working class voters in the state. Despite the fact that he did worse in the suburbs, he was able to do better in the driftless region and in the rurals, and that's what led him to win Wisconsin. Then Biden was able to do even better in the suburbs in 2020 and also able to cut into Trump's white working class support, and so he was able to win the state. In 2024, Wisconsin has actually been one of Trump's worst states polling-wise. Before Biden dropped out, Trump was only leading by 1.5 points, and before he dropped out, he was only leading Harris by 1.8 points. Now, DDHQ has Harris leading by 0.7 points, but it is important to note that both in 2016 and 2020, Trump was underestimated in Wisconsin polling by around 6 points. So he was down by 6 points to Hillary Clinton, ended up winning it. He was down by around 7 to 8 to Joe Biden, and then ended up only losing it by a fraction of a percent. So despite the fact that Harris is leading in the polling right now, I do think Trump is going to pull off the state of Wisconsin. I don't think the polling error is going to be as big as the last 2 elections, but I do think he's going to win it by a little over a point, so I am going to call it tilt Republican for now. Next is going to be Michigan, and Michigan is another state that flipped from Obama to Trump in 2016, then back to Biden in 2020. Biden won it by a little more than Wisconsin. He won it by a little more than 2 points. And Trump has been polling well in Michigan for quite a while this election cycle. Before Biden dropped out, Trump was over Biden by 2.6 points, and he was over Harris by 2.2 points. Now, Harris is leading Trump by 1.2 points in the average, but this is kind of skewed because there is a poll in the average right now by Morning Consult that has Harris up by 11, and normally that wouldn't throw it off too much, but because this is still kind of a new race developing, there's only 8 polls in the average, so that's throwing off the average by a lot right now. In my last video, I did have Trump narrowly winning Michigan over Biden, but things have kind of changed since then. I thought that maybe because the Teamsters president was speaking at the RNC that Trump was going to have a better chance in Michigan. But the United Auto Workers did endorse Harris the other day, and I think that's going to help Trump in Michigan, or help Harris in Michigan a lot, because one of the reasons Biden was doing so poorly in Michigan, a lot of people attributed it to the fact that he was doing poorly with Muslim voters because Michigan has a relatively high Muslim population, but really it was because the economy was not doing great in Michigan, and especially in the auto industry. So Harris getting the United Auto Workers endorsement is going to help her a lot. I do think she's going to pull off the state of Michigan probably by a couple points, so I'm going to call it lean Democrat. Next up is going to be Georgia, and Georgia is another state that Trump's been polling very well in pretty much all cycle. Before Biden dropped out, Trump was leading Biden in Georgia by 4 points, and he was leading Harris in Georgia by 6 points. Now, post Biden dropping out, Trump is leading by 3.1 points in the DDHQ average. And this is a state that I never really doubted Harris would do better than Biden in, because Georgia has a much higher black population than most of the other swing states. And so I do think she's going to be able to invigorate the minority base in Georgia better than Joe Biden would have been able to do. And Georgia polling tends to be pretty accurate. In 2020, it was showing a very close race. It showed Biden leading by around a point, and Biden ended up winning by a fraction of a point. In 2022, it had Herschel Walker leading slightly. Raphael Warnock ended up winning very slightly. He led going into the runoff, and then the runoff polls had him winning, and he ended up winning. Overall, I do still think Trump is going to win Georgia, but I do think it's going to be a lot closer now. I'm going to call Georgia tilt Republican. Next up is going to be North Carolina, and of all of the swing states that I've covered, North Carolina was the most Republican in 2022. In fact, it was the only, or in 2020. In fact, it was the only state that Trump won of the swing states. And he did only win it by about a point and a half. Because of the way he's been polling nationally and in the swing states, I do think he's going to increase his margin in North Carolina this time around. I'm going to call North Carolina lean Republican. There haven't really been many polls of Trump versus Harris in North Carolina, but based on what I saw versus Biden and how polls have trended towards Kamala Harris, I still don't think that she's going to be able to win North Carolina, especially if she's not winning Georgia. So I'm pretty confident in saying that Trump is going to win North Carolina, at least for now. Finally, we have the state of Pennsylvania, and this is going to be the biggest swing state this cycle with 19 electoral votes. And of course, this is another state that flipped from Obama to Trump in 2016, then Trump to Biden in 2020. Before Biden dropped out, Trump was leading him by 4.6 points in Pennsylvania. Before he dropped out, Trump was leading Harris by 4.4 points. Now Trump is leading Harris by 1.9 points. And this is another one actually where the average is kind of skewed, but this time it's skewed towards Trump. The same poll that had Michigan up The same poll that had Harris up by 11 in Michigan has Trump up by 5 in Pennsylvania. And obviously, those two cannot happen at the same time. So this poll is kind of garbage, but it's included in both averages. So this one's actually skewed towards Trump. But there are more polls in the average, so it's not skewed as poorly. There's 15 polls in the Pennsylvania average right now. And it's also important to note that the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, the Democrat, is on the short list to be Kamala Harris's vice presidential nominee. And if she does pick him, that will help the ticket in Pennsylvania. It's not going to make it a done deal. It's not going to make Pennsylvania definitely going to Harris, but it would help. Because of the way that the polls are kind of skewed towards Trump in Pennsylvania right now, and because of the momentum that Harris has, I actually do think she's going to narrowly pick off Pennsylvania, so I am going to call it tilt Democrat. I think it's going to be very close. So now with all these states filled in, I do have Donald Trump very narrowly winning 278 to 260 over Vice President Kamala Harris. And honestly, by now, we should be having a clear picture of what's happening in the election, and we really did have a clear picture forming when Joe Biden was the nominee. But because of this unprecedented move of pulling the nominee and replacing him, things are very up in the air right now. So I could honestly see all of this being wrong. I think post-DNC and going into September and October, we'll have a much clearer picture. Right now, it's still early because there still aren't enough polls showing a matchup between Harris and Trump. So a lot of this is just kind of my own personal opinion and conclusions I made based on past polling versus Biden and what I think polls are going to do with Harris. But anyway, guys, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you like my content, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload. And also leave a like and comment. Let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day.